The New Yorker, as well as several newspapers. Until last year, the Newhouse family also owned the largest publishing house in the U.S., Random House. While in Chicago recently, Miss Felsenthal discussed the Newhouse family, her book, and the difficulties in getting it published. Carol Felsenthal's biography.
Hello, and welcome. It's my great pleasure to introduce our speaker today. Many of us have read Carol Felsenthal's biography of Katharine Graham, Power, Privilege, and the Post, published in 1993. If her earlier works didn't do it, this one certainly established the author as an honest, if somewhat controversial, biographer. Honest because she writes well and persuasively, and controversial because she writes about important figures whose friends are sometimes in the publishing business and aren't friendly to what she is writing. Such has been the case with her biography of the powerful publisher S.I. Newhouse, Jr. Her contract to write a biography of Newhouse led to a completed manuscript, which the publisher then declined to publish for what might politely be called personal reasons. She was paid the balance of her contract, and the manuscript went to Seven Stories Press, and we are the happy recipients of a copy of the final results. Ms. Felsenthal is a native of Chicago. She received her undergraduate degree from the University of Illinois and her MA from Boston College. I am pleased not to welcome her home because this is home for her 3 children, her husband, and herself, but to welcome her to this group of readers and devotees of good books. Please join me, therefore, in a hearty welcome to our own Carol Felsenthal.
I was afraid that you were going to give my speech. I'm glad that you, since I plan to talk today about the very rocky road that this Newhouse biography has had on the way to publication. But yesterday I had a bit of a coincidental experience. Our trash compactor in our kitchen broke, and the man from Whirlpool came to fix it, and I answered the door in my usual getup of jeans and t-shirt, and he had been to fix the same appliance a month ago, so he knew me a little bit, and he said to me, "Are you an author?" And some surprise in the tone of his voice, and I said, "Yes, I am. How did you know?" And he said he had been in Hyde Park this morning fixing the garbage disposal, and the owner of the house had spread the Chicago Tribune on the floor to protect it. And you see, newspapers are not only used to wrap up yesterday's fish. So while he was repairing the garbage disposal, he saw the ad for the Heartland Literary Society, and he recognized the name, and I thought it was a nice coincidence, although to myself I was thinking that I wish that there had been a copy of the actual book on the kitchen counter, and he had made the association that way. My subject, Cy Newhouse, the name provokes puzzled expressions on the faces of people outside Manhattan and some of the suburbs of New Jersey and some of the more exclusive precincts of Connecticut. People simply don't know who he is. And for me, that was a change from my last subject, Katharine Graham. People knew her because of the Watergate investigation, which she pursued with a great deal of courage, and the publication of the Pentagon Papers, which I believe was really her finest hour. And occasionally they would mistake her for Martha Graham, but a nudge in the right direction would get them on the K. Graham wavelength. When my book on Graham was published in 1993, it was excerpted in Vanity Fair, which is owned by my current subject, Cy Newhouse. Needless to say, this book was not excerpted in Vanity Fair. When that piece in Vanity Fair appeared about a month before the actual publication of the book, I heard from my agent, my editor, friends in New York and Washington, that Mrs. Graham was, to put it mildly, not pleased. Kay Graham is a sensitive, some would say, I would say extremely thin-skinned person who becomes extremely upset if anything is written about her that is not what, in my opinion, would qualify as a complete puff piece. It is hypocritical, of course, because her own newspaper, the Washington Post, pioneered the new feature section that took over for the women's sections of newspapers, and that section is called the Style section. And the Style section, especially under the pen of Sally Quinn, was known for delving very deeply into the lives of subjects, some of whom were not even public figures. But she was quite upset, and I heard also through friends in Washington and people on the Washington Post that the book editor of the Washington Post was considered to be in the most terrible position that any journalist would ever want to be in, because a book about Katharine Graham had to be covered in the Post book section. She couldn't have gotten away with not covering it. The book editor, Nina King, had to assign it and pray every morning, afternoon, and night that the reviewer would despise it and give it a terrible review, because otherwise it was known that Mrs. Graham would come stomping into her office and create a scene. Well, the reviewer was a man named Ronald Steele, who is a greatly applauded biographer, an academic, a serious man who writes about issues of foreign policy, and wrote a biography of Walter Lippmann, which in my opinion is the best newspaper biography ever written, a biography that I so admire that for the last 10 years or so I've kept it above my desk on the shelf. And he reviewed my book, and I, of course, was delighted, and people at the Post less so, that he loved it. And the review ran, to Mrs. Graham's credit, because she could have just demanded that it be tossed. Of course, had she done that, the news would have been out in 5 minutes, and that would have created many worse problems for her. So it ran in the book section at the end of the section with no photographs, no type outtakes. It looked like just a mass of gray, but there it was. And after that review ran, that's when we heard from Kay Graham's lawyers. The letter went to my then publisher, Phyllis Gran, at Putnam, and I was told by people at Putnam that Phyllis was very worried about this, because Mrs. Graham is a great power. At the time I wrote about her, she was worth about $490 million, so this is not somebody to be dealt with lightly. And Phyllis Gran, the publisher of Putnam, was reported to me that she said at a meeting, "I will never publish an unauthorized biography of a living person again." Now that statement, when I heard it, I thought that was a pretty terrible thing for a publisher to say, because publishers should be in the business of bringing books to the attention of the public, to the public, and there are plenty of unauthorized biographies that need to be written about people who are still among us, and in fact they should be written while these people are still working. A biography of Cy Newhouse after he dies or after his retirement would be a very different sort of book and carry a very different sort of message. What happened to me at Putnam after the lawyer's letter arrived was a couple of months of having to drag boxes of yellowing news clips and audio tapes. I taped all of my interviews and reprove a lot of what was in the book, and it was a very discouraging time for me, but the book was very well sourced. There were scores of pages of chapter notes, and eventually Mrs. Graham went away, more or less. But in the meantime, Ted Turner had bought the rights to do a television movie based on the book, and Graham reportedly got to him, and suddenly that project was canceled. Putnam really stopped advertising and promoting the book, and very shortly thereafter was taken out of print. I consider Catherine Graham to be not much better than a common censor. And so when her memoir came out a few years ago, and in book review sections and newspapers, she was celebrated as this great defender and supporter of the First Amendment, I had a very different picture of her, although when I started the book about Graham, I knew the history of the predecessor biography that was written, in fact, by a Chicago woman named Deborah Davis, a book called Catherine the Great, published in 1979, a perfectly good book about Graham that had some errors in it. And Ben Bradley, Kay Graham's executive editor, was able to go through it and go to the publisher, Bill Jovanovich, and said, there are 19 errors, or every time I mentioned in the index there's a mistake. Well, that's very common in nonfiction books, because nonfiction books, are not fact-checked the way that a magazine article would be. When my excerpt of the Graham book was published in Vanity Fair, a fact-checker there fact-checked every word of that piece. We went over and over things. That is not done at book publishers, because most book publishing editors are in the business of acquiring books, of taking agents and authors to lunch or bringing in the people that they want. They don't have the time to actually take a blue pencil to the text. At Putnam, I was very lucky to have a wonderful editor, a woman named Faith Sale, who was the person who more or less discovered and brought Amy Tan into Putnam and has done some wonderful books. And she read every line of the book, and it was also very carefully copy edited. And I was very careful, because I knew that I was writing about a woman who was going to look at this book very carefully. So that book, the predecessor biography, the Davis biography, was actually pulled by the publisher from the shelves, I think 40,000 copies of it, and shredded by Harcourt Brace Jovanovich. So I knew that when I came into this project that it was not going to be a cakewalk. After the Graham book was published, a few months after, I was looking for another subject. My husband, who's a lawyer, gave me two pieces of advice. He said, next time write about somebody who's dead, because the dead can't sue you for libel. Or they can't threaten nonsense actions against you. And next time, write about somebody who's not worth almost $500 million. Instead of taking his advice, which over the last 5 years that I worked on the Newhouse book, I, believe me, wish often that I had, I decided to sign a contract to write a book about Cy Newhouse, who's not worth $5.5 million. He's worth, or $500 million. He's worth $4.5 billion. He is a man who is even more private about his own life than was Catherine Graham. I mean, this is Cy Newhouse. One of the really interesting things about him, I think that Kay Graham always understood that she was being a hypocrite when she so discouraged and put barriers in front of people writing about her. But Cy Newhouse doesn't seem to get it. He doesn't even seem to realize that. So when I was doing my research, I came across a woman who writes for Fortune magazine and wanted to do a piece on Cy Newhouse and his brother Donald. The two of them, together worth $9 billion, divide the business. Cy runs the magazine part of the business, which includes Vanity Fair, as I said before, The New Yorker, Vogue, Mademoiselle, Glamour, Brides, GQ, there are more, House and Garden. And until recently, Cy also ran Random House. Early in 1998, Random House, which under the Newhouse ownership, was making a very small profit, if any, was sold to Bertelsmann, the German conglomerate, that was Bertelsmann was willing to vastly overpay for Random House because it wanted a foothold in the American publishing business, and Random House gave it about as good a foothold as one could get. Donald, the brother, runs I think today it's 26 mostly monopoly newspapers and the cable business. Donald makes an enormous amount of money because these newspapers, by design, and I'll show you how in a bit, are monopoly papers, and they are what Kay Graham's good friend Warren Buffett calls an unregulated toll booth. It was for that reason that Buffett saw and began investing in the Washington Post, which for all intents and purposes is a monopoly paper in Washington, because there is no more profitable business to have, even in the days of the internet, than a monopoly newspaper. So some of the newspapers that the Newhouses own are the Cleveland Plain Dealer, the Newark Star-Ledger, the New Orleans Times-Picayune, and the Portland Oregonian. Cy Newhouse is not only very much alive, but in his early 70s, he's extremely active in the business. He's known for arriving at the office between 4 and 5 in the morning. He reads every line of every magazine. He knows about the circulation numbers, the advertising numbers. Within the Condé Nast organization, the great fear is that somebody will arrive in his office and be hit with what's called yellow rain, which is memos written in a blue felt tip pen on a yellow legal pad from Cy Newhouse saying, for example, to the publisher of Brides magazine, it said that Cy Newhouse actually reads every word of Brides magazine, so if he seems, to me, he sometimes seemed like a slightly off-kilter figure, and it's understandable if thinking about him doing that, but he'll write to the publisher of Brides magazine, why is the ad on page 15 only a quarter page, and in 2 issues ago was a half page, or why is this page bled to the edge, or why to the publisher of Glamour magazine does Cosmo have such and such ad and we don't. He gets very, very deeply involved. When I decided to take on Cy Newhouse as my subject, I was with a different publisher, Viking Press. After my experience with Phyllis Grant at Putnam, I told my agent, much as I love my editor, Faith Sale, I do not want to be published by this house anymore because I thought that she really folded in the face of threats from Newhouse. So I was in New York meeting with a bunch of publishers to decide what I was going to do next. And when I got to Viking Press, there was a wonderful editor there, and a man named Al Silverman, a veteran editor, used to be head of Book of the Month Club, had been at Viking for a long time, did very serious books. In fact, one of the books that he did was a biography of Stuart and Joe Alsop, which I greatly admired. And I know that when Viking signed that book and Al signed it, he couldn't possibly expect that this was going to make money for the house, because the Alsop brothers it's a generational thing, but most people who, when I talked about them, don't know who they were. But they were, like Walter Lippmann, very influential columnists in Washington. And it was Al Silverman who asked me to write the book about Cy Newhouse. He said, we think that it's very important that somebody write about this man. He owns so much of the media. He is so influential, and yet if you say his name to a group of 100 people, 99 won't know who he is. You wrote about Kay Graham with her opposition, with all of the roadblocks that she put in front of you. We think you're the person to do it. And then he told me the mildly insulting aside that everybody of the stature that they were looking for to write this book, they couldn't get. The reason is that they couldn't get these people is because they had contracts with Condé Nast. They were writing for the New Yorker or Vanity Fair, or their spouse or their companion had a contract with Random House, or they hoped to write to have a contract with Random House or a contract with Condé Nast, because Cy Newhouse pays writers so very well, and writers ought to be paid well. But if you make it into the upper precincts of Condé Nast, there are clothing allowance, there's private school tuition paid, there's interest-free loans for co-ops on the Upper East Side or a country house in Connecticut. And these are all really fabulous perks. Well, here I am in Chicago with a husband who has a law practice here and 3 kids in school, and I'm not in the market for an Upper East Side co-op or a country home. So I'm the person who takes on this enormous and difficult and frustrating assignment. The book took 5 years to write, from the time I signed the contract to its publication date. When I started it, I felt like a relatively young person. Now I'm turning, in April, I'll turn 50, and I really feel like this book has been part of my life for far too long. The Graham book took me 3 years to write, and in the middle of it, I had our 3rd child. So this was much more difficult. I've often thought, and my children have often asked me, why don't you write a novel? Why write nonfiction? Nonfiction today, in the litigious times in which we live, especially the kind of nonfiction that I do about living people with enormous power and enormous wealth, is really very difficult. But a couple of years ago, sat down and started to sketch out a novel. And it was a political novel because I really have a passion for politics and the political scene and the media scene. And I have since I've been since I was in college. And this is the subject that I would write if I were going to write fiction or nonfiction. So I started sketching it out. And then events overtook me. And I believe strongly in the adage that truth is stranger than fiction, and I think that the circus ongoing in Washington is the best example of that. And if I were to write a novel and put in any of the ins and outs and subplots of the Monica Lewinsky saga, I'm sure that an editor would have told me this is far too far-fetched to appear and to be believable. But you know, there are a couple of things that have struck me. One today, which is that a year ago when the Monica Lewinsky scandal broke, the Pope was in Cuba saying a mass there, and as soon as this name that we had never heard about, Monica Lewinsky, hit the airwaves, and all of the network correspondents and the Washington bureau chiefs of the major newspapers all went running to the airplanes to get back to Washington to cover this story. And here we are a year later, and yesterday President Clinton is undergoing this trial in the Senate that could, unlikely as it seems now, result in his removal from office. And he goes to St. Louis as if to have the Pope's holiness and approval cast upon him. And the other, and then there's this great newspaper reporting, Maureen Dowd in today's New York Times, reporting that a poll that was taken by USA Today, CNN, shows that Clinton is more admired than the Pope in the latest survey. So this stuff it's so comical, and it's so bizarre that nonfiction seems to me the subject to stick to. In fact, I was asked to write a book about Hillary Clinton, and I considered it, but the reason that I didn't run with that idea, and Hillary Clinton would be a good subject for me for many reasons, one of which is at least she's from here, because my subjects have all been East Coast subjects with the exception of Phyllis Schlafly. And I could do the beginning research from Chicago, but I didn't run with that idea because I am spending my time now trying to bring this Newhouse book to the attention of the public, because my little publisher, Seven Stories Press, doesn't have the kind of budget to promote and to advertise the book. So I feel that I have to be there. As I say to my husband every morning when he asks me what I'm going to do, I say, well, I'm going to keep stirring the kettle and try to create a kind of a word of mouth for this book that in other publishers might be able to create just by getting the ads out. one of the other, just as you'll indulge me in just giving you another little tidbit of information that so interested me about this Lewinsky matter, and that is the fact that one of the House managers, Asa Hutchinson of Arkansas, is now I guess he would be called a prosecutor in the Senate. And there was some talk a couple of weeks ago about whether it was proper for Asa Hutchinson to have this role because his brother, Tim Hutchinson, is a senator from Arkansas and a, in quotes, juror now. And, but the really interesting thing about Asa Hutchinson that no novelist could ever get away with making up is that he was the man who prosecuted Bill Clinton's brother, Roger Clinton, on drug charges and sent him to prison. And after that case was finished, Bill Clinton called Asa Hutchinson and said, thank you, you saved my brother's life. And who would ever think that some years later he would be back, the family again would be back under this guy's thumb. Let me tell you a little bit about my mysterious subject. I just want to rather quickly sketch his life. I devote the first third of this book, as I did in my Graham book. I started with her parents, who her father bought the newspaper out of bankruptcy. He was a man born to wealth who accumulated much more wealth, $1 a year, public servant through several presidential administrations. In 1933, buys the Post out of bankruptcy because he wants to give Washington a great editorial and op-ed page. Sam Newhouse, the founder of the company that his sons control today, was a very different sort of man. He grew up in abject poverty on the Lower East Side of New York. His father was a man who liked to think great thoughts but didn't much like to work. The father fathered 8 children. Sam Newhouse's mother, all 4.5 feet of her, would get up before dawn, go and buy from a wholesale dealer sheets and pillowcases and towels, carry them over her shoulders, going door to door, peddling them in order to support the 8 children. Sam Newhouse, having finished 8th grade, realized that his father would never properly support the family and that his mother was going to be bent under this burden. Sam Newhouse quit school and went to work. He happened to go to work for a lawyer who, in a client with an unpaid debt, gave him a money-losing paper in Bayonne, New Jersey, across the river from Manhattan, and the paper was losing nothing but money. The lawyer figured eventually we'd have to sell it. Sam Newhouse, still a teenager, barely 5 feet tall himself, uneducated, understands right away that the reason that this paper is losing money is because the advertisers don't see any reason to advertise in it. He comes up with strategies to get advertising. The paper starts making money. Sam gets a bigger stake in it. Then he starts buying newspapers. He buys the Staten Island Advance, as they call it in the family. He buys the Newark Star Ledger. He buys the Jersey Journal. And pretty soon, he's worth $100 million. He owns these newspapers that are not glamorous. They're not the New York Times. They're not the Chicago Tribune. They're small papers. Once he gets his capital built up, he overpays for the papers because he very carefully calculates, looks, examines, and knows in which cities he'll be able to acquire first that one newspaper, then the other newspapers in town, shut them down and have the monopoly newspaper. He does this again and again and again, and soon he owns some really big properties. As he always called them properties. To him, that's what they were. He was interested never in the editorial side of the paper. He was interested in the bottom line. If a paper was a good paper, and it was making money, that was fine. If it was an awful paper and it was making money, that was fine. If it was left of center and it was making money, okay. If it were very right of center, for example, the St. Louis Globe Democrat, that was okay too. He could have owned a chain of shoe stores. If that client with the unpaid bill had a local shoe store, then Sam Newhouse would have been the biggest operator of shoe stores in the country. And it was for that reason that the New Yorker's famous press critic, A.J. Liebling, referred to Sam Newhouse with enormous disdain as a rag picker, a man who bought second-rate newspapers, turned them into third-rate newspapers, and went away with his satchel full of money. So very different character than Eugene Meyer, Kay Graham's father, who lost plenty of money on the Washington Post for plenty of years because he wanted to bring a refined and intelligent op-ed page to the people of Washington. It was in this family that Cy Newhouse grew up, and it was a seismic change from Sam Newhouse, who used to sleep on a board put over the bathtub in a one-room apartment with 7 siblings and his parents, and suddenly he has a lot of money. He marries a woman named Mitzi Newhouse, whose name is vaguely familiar to people because she is a theater in Lincoln Center is named for her. Mitzi Newhouse loves her 2 sons, Donald and Cy. Theoretically, she wants to be a good mother, but she really has one major interest, and that's in her appearance. Her goal is to be on the best dress list. She's dragging Sam Newhouse off to Paris to look at couture. She has the best makeup people and hair people. Sam Newhouse, their first house together was on Staten Island, which was a good place for them because, after all, he owned the paper there. But Mitzi gets tired of Staten Island very quickly, and she finds a duplex co-op on Park Avenue, and the family moves there. Cy and his brother go to a school in Riverdale up in the Bronx called the Horace Mann School. At the time that they were in school in the 40s, the good private schools in New York had quotas on Jewish students. Horace Mann was an excellent school with an excellent record of sending boys on to the Ivy League colleges, which is what they all wanted, and so Cy Newhouse goes there. One of his, not his classmates, a year ahead of him is a man named Roy Cohn, who's a very important figure in my book because he was a school friend of Cy Newhouse's, and then later in the 50s through the 80s, when Roy Cohn died of the AIDS virus, he and Cy were very best friends. Cy is a very little, homely, he's not much taller than his father's 5 feet. He's inarticulate, he's almost neurotically shy. As I do in writing these books, I went back and I tried to find every student I could who went to school with him, and the response was, yeah, we remember him, but we can't really remember anything about him. He wasn't an athlete, he wasn't much of a student, he had a tough time making his mark. His father was then worth a couple $100 million, and Cy would have loved to have gone to Harvard or to Yale. He settles on Cornell, and he puts in the high school yearbook that he will be going to Cornell, and then Cornell rejects him, and he ends up at Syracuse University. I've often thought that Cornell must have been very sorry that it rejected him, because Syracuse University now has a distinguished and very large journalism program called the Newhouse School of Communications, which was set up at Syracuse by Sam Newhouse. He doesn't much like college, isn't happy there. He leaves without a degree, meets his wife, Jane, who I interviewed for this book, a lovely, down-to-earth, sweet woman, meets her at Syracuse, marries her. Pretty soon he has 3 kids. He has his own co-op on Park Avenue. His father, he's the older of the 2 sons, and the father figures he will be the person who will lead this company. But Cy doesn't like the newspaper business. He doesn't get any pleasure from it. He's not interested in the advertising and the circulation figures. He will be with his magazines later, but he doesn't like the newspaper business. He doesn't like going to Newark, New Jersey, to Jersey City, to St. Louis, to the places where Sam has these decidedly unglamorous papers. And Sam is worried about him. Cy starts to live. He wants to be part of cafe society in New York. He re-establishes his friendship with Roy Cohn. He drags Jane out every night. She'd rather stay home with the children, but they're going to 21. They're at a table with Roy Cohn and with the gossip columnists of the day, and pretty soon the marriage breaks up. And by 1959, the marriage is over, and Sam and Mitzi are very worried about Cy. They don't see where his future is going to be in the newspaper business. Donald has taken it to it like a duck to water. He goes every morning to Newark, New Jersey, where he runs the newspapers out of the Newark Star-Ledger, happy to do it. He's the Sam's son of sons, and Cy is just kind of floundering around. In the meantime, in 1959, Sam Newhouse goes out one Sunday morning for a walk, and he says to Mitzi, can I bring you anything? And she says, yes, bring me Vogue. Well, it was that year that he bought Condé, that Sam Newhouse bought Condé Nast, and he loved to tell the story. Mitzi asked me to buy her Vogue, and so I bought her the whole company. In fact, it's Sam Newhouse was far too shrewd to buy a magazine company to please Mitzi, although he did love her very much, and he would spend anything on whatever it was she wanted. I describe her in the book as a serial redecorator. She would decorate the duplex apartment, and then she'd call in another interior decorator and say, I hate it, you know what to do, fix it. And so there was always a new antique furniture and new wallpaper going up in the apartment. But in fact, Sam saw Condé Nast as a company that was underperforming, that was could be profitable if operated correctly, and he figured he'd send some Newhouse third cousin over to run it. Little did he expect, and I'm convinced he would have never bought the company had he realized that Cy Newhouse would walk into the glamorous Condé Nast offices, see the beautiful rail-thin models, the glamorous editors, and fall in love with the business. Now, the people at Condé Nast the company was about to go bankrupt, so they needed a Sam Newhouse, but they absolutely didn't know what to make of it. In those years, there was an element of anti-Semitism in Condé Nast, and being owned by this man who nobody knew, who had none of the glamour of the business, none of the history of it, was unsettling, to say the least. But eventually, Cy Newhouse went to work there. People who were smart recognized that he would be the person to own the company, and they'd better try to help him learn the job and learn the business. And today, he is very much ensconced in the Condé Nast building. You know, I know that I'm probably coming up against a time deadline, so whoever knows what it is, tell me when I should, you know, or raise a finger or something. But let me, the Condé Nast under Cy Newhouse has been not a successful business. And I say in the book that Donald Newhouse makes the money on the monopoly newspapers with their very high profit margins, on the cable business, and Cy has spent it lavishly at Condé Nast. When he wants something, he goes after it and he buys it. When he decided he wanted to get into book publishing, he didn't start his own publishing company, which he could have done, or he didn't buy a fringe company. He went and he bought Random House, the most prestigious American company, and in some respects he really ran it into the ground in the years that they owned it, from 1980 to 1998. He changed the very basic values of the company, started throwing a lot of money at celebrity books. Marlon Brando, $5 million, millions of dollars in losses because he didn't write a book that anybody wanted to read. He didn't tell anything really. He gave $2.5 million, I think, to Dick Morris, who was another Clinton administration sex scandal figure. He, in 1985, decided he wanted the New Yorker, and that has been what has brought him most into the news lately. He vastly overpaid for it because he wanted it. The people at the New Yorker were more horrified than the people at Condé Nast were when Sam Newhouse came in to buy them. When he bought the New Yorker in 1985, the New Yorker had made money every year but one since its founding in 1925. Cy Newhouse came in And that year, 1985, there were losses, and there have been losses every year since, as much as $30 million a year. He, of course, is the person who promised that the legendary editor William Shawn could stay as long as he wanted. 2 years later, Cy, in a humiliating fashion, fired him. He had an interim editor, but I believe he really had his eye on Tina Brown, who turned that magazine upside down. And people have said to me, this is Cy's revenge on Liebling, who had called his father a rag picker. But I think that while there may be some of that, what Cy really wanted was he wanted his magazine to be in the news. That overused word buzz is what Cy Newhouse lives for. His magazine has to be talked about at certain kinds of cocktail parties in Manhattan. That is so important to him. So Tina Brown came in and she turned the New Yorker. Personally, I think it's a far more interesting magazine than it was under Shawn. I subscribed to it for years, but I really didn't read it very often because the articles weren't interesting to me and they were too long. So Tina Brown came in and she turned it into a media magazine, to a magazine about Hollywood celebrities. So really, in some ways, and to a magazine that breaks news. It was the New Yorker that broke the story about Linda Tripp having been arrested when she was 18 years old. A completely different magazine than the old New Yorker, but one that created all this publicity for him, still losing $12 million a year. Let me just end by talking about what happened to this book, and I'll try to be brief about it. In 1996, I got up one morning and opened up my New York Times, and there was a story that my publisher, Viking Press, its parent company, had bought Putnam. Putnam was the publisher of my Graham book, and it was run by Phyllis Grant. I knew as soon as I read that I was in trouble because I knew that Phyllis Grant was such a commercially successful publisher. She had Tom Clancy and Robin Cook and Amy Tan, very shrewd commercial publisher. I knew she'd end up running the whole operation. And I was in the process of writing at that time. Late in 1997, I finished the book. It was in. Al Silverman had accepted it, praised it, sent it over to the Putnam lawyers for legal vetting. And then he called me one day late in 1997 and told me he was retiring, which was very upsetting because an author doesn't want to be what's called orphaned in the book business just before the book is ready to come out. But there the book is sitting in legal vetting. We don't hear anything about it. My agent tells me not to worry because it's a holiday, and holidays and publishing closes down during the holidays, and something will happen after the first of the year. Well, something did happen. Phyllis Grant called my agent, invited her out to lunch, said the Felsenthal manuscript is a wonderful manuscript. She's a wonderful writer. I love the Graham book, which I thought took especially a lot of nerve to say that. And but I can't publish this book because there's a friend of mine on every page. And then she added, without, according to my agent, any parent embarrassment in saying it, my husband, Phyllis Grant's husband, is about to go skiing with Alberto Vitale. Alberto Vitale was then the chairman of Random House, then still owned by Cy Newhouse, as if that's a reason not to publish a book that is, that in fact Viking had asked me to write and that I had fulfilled my obligations on and spent 4 years researching and writing. She said, but don't worry, we'll pay Carol everything we owe her. And in fact, after it happened, I called a reporter from the New York Times because I thought this was a big story. I thought this ought to be out there. I knew that it would hurt me career-wise to make too much out of this. And my agent said, you know, don't say bad things about Phyllis Grant. You're just going to shoot yourself in the foot by doing that. And I said, no, I'm going to, because I think this is a story that has to be out there. When I called this reporter from the New York Times and told her the story, she said, where's the story? You were paid all your money. And I said, you know, yeah, but that's not the point. The point is that I feel that this book is really being repressed. So Phyllis said to my agent that, don't worry, you'll sell it in a second, and of course none of the big publishers in New York even wanted to see it because they didn't want to be put in the position of having to reject it. But you know, why were people so afraid of it? Because Cy Newhouse controls so much of media. When a book comes out, when my Graham book comes out, where did we go to sell those excerpt rights? We took it right to Vanity Fair because we knew that was the right magazine for this book, and it brought a lot of attention to the book. The Graham book was reviewed in the New Yorker. Every publisher wants its books reviewed in the New Yorker. It was reviewed in many, many of the Newhouse papers. This Newhouse book hasn't been reviewed in any of the Newhouse papers, even though they have traditionally reviewed my books. The New Yorker hasn't made mention of it, or Vanity Fair. And I don't believe that it's those editors. I don't believe that they received an order from Cy Newhouse or an edict, don't do anything with the Felsenthal books. They censor themselves, and I think that that is part of the story. I had something, just to end now. In 1993, I sent one of the first copies of the Graham book to a man who had been an editorial writer for the Washington Post, and then he went over to the New York Times to write editorials there. So he knew Graham, and he knew her husband, Phil Graham. He knew the parents a little bit. So he invited me to his office in the New York Times, and I did a good on-the-record interview with him. And I sent him one of the early copies, and he wrote me back a letter, and he said that he praised the book, my reporting, my writing. He said he found just one trivial error, which was calling the London Times, mixing up the London Times and the Sunday Times of London. And he said that he hoped that I would prepare myself to have, in quotes, rocks thrown your way. I hope you always remember that your detractors are in the business of disclosure, and that the essential unfairness exposed in your pages is the immunity from scrutiny that publishers and editors are so quick to confer on their own lives. I'm looking for another subject. I guess some people would call it another victim, but I'm looking for another subject. Any ideas are welcome. I'm thinking about doing another book on the media, and specifically maybe doing a book on the on the family that owns the New York Times. If I'm going to make enemies, I guess I got to make them in the really important places, and I'd be happy to take any questions.
Anyone has questions, but those of you that need to leave, feel free to.
Yes.
Have you attempted to speak with Mr. Newhouse himself or present the book to him?
He didn't. When I started writing the Graham book and I wrote to her, she always answered my letters. They just became more unfriendly and curt as I continued writing them. But Newhouse, no answer to any letter, just never answered the letters. And it was the pattern that I found. At one point in, I think in the summer of 1995, I sat down and I wrote letters to every editor-in-chief of every Condé Nast magazine, the top people at Random House, the top people at the newspapers. And, you know, here I am, a legitimate journalist with a track record. I received, on the editorial side, because I also wrote to people on the business side, I received not a single response. So, again, I don't believe that Newhouse issued an order to people not to respond to my letters. I think that they just censor themselves, and that is not good, because obviously if they had, you know, when I was writing about Graham and I wrote to Ben Bradley, he said he couldn't talk to me, and I understood it. I understand why people don't want to talk in an on-the-record way about the man who signs their paycheck. On the one hand, on the other hand, they should have responded in some thoughtful way to. But the answer to your question is no. I never talked to Newhouse, and he never responded to any of my entreaties. Yes.
What archives do you use to find this information if they're trying to keep you out?
Oh. Well, you know, I wish the director of the Newberry Library were still here, because the Graham book there was much more archival information about the Grahams, because the father's papers are in the Library of Congress. In the case of the Newhouses, there are papers at Syracuse University. He gave all these millions of dollars to start the Newhouse School of Communications. I wrote to the librarian there, and I went through a couple of phone calls and letters, but eventually was told that the Newhouse brothers, Donald Newhouse, I think specifically, had been asked if it would be okay to give me access, and he said no. So the director of the library there said no. Now, Syracuse University is a private institution, but I still thought that it was a pretty tawdry. And this was difficult. That's why I did somewhere between 400 and 500 interviews for this book. because Sam Newhouse had a policy that never to commit anything to paper. He kept everything in his head. He had a photographic memory, and he could spill out figures from 10 years ago or 15 years ago. He could tell you what the circulation figure of every paper that he didn't own in a city or in a region was. He never put anything on paper. The reason was that he was always worried that the government would start looking closely at him and would limit the number of papers that he could own, because there was a move in Congress to limit chain ownerships of papers, and eventually it was dropped as being an infringement of the First Amendment. But Sam Newhouse was terrified of this, that he would have to sell some of these papers and he wouldn't be able to acquire any new ones, which was essentially what he lived for. So there wasn't a paper trail, and that's why this book was so dependent on interviews. And I started my day always with the obituary page of the New York Times, and I used to get the Washington Post by mail in Chicago with all the grocery ads and everything. Now I get it on the internet, but I go immediately to the obituary page because so many of the people who I needed to interview about Sam Newhouse and Mitzi Newhouse and the start of the company were very elderly people, and I wanted to get to them first, and then sometimes I would, literally lose a source. So that's the kind of book that this was. There wasn't much of an archive. There are letters that Cy wrote to Allard Lowenstein, who was a classmate of his at Horace Mann. He was later a congressman from New York and a very important supporter of Bobby Kennedy's. But the archival information was sparse, and obviously Cy Newhouse was not going to invite me into the Condé Nast archive. Yes?
Since Cy Newhouse is not making any money or very little money, how does his brother Donald feel about, he must subsidize the operations, how does he feel about his brother?
Well, those two men have a model relationship. It's a wonderful relationship. They seem to genuinely respect and care about each other, but I think that Cy has been kind of indulged, and my speculation is, and it's backed up by people who are in position to know, is that Donald finally said to Cy, as they're trying to ready the company for the third generation of Newhouse men who will take over eventually, is that Donald said to Cy, you can have one money loser but not two. And that's why they sold Random House. And there's some people who think that he'll sell the New Yorker because the New Yorker has been an enormous drain on the finances of this company. But my guess is that they will never sell the New Yorker. And if it continues to lose money, what they might do is change it to a biweekly. So Cy has been indulged, but it's not as if the company is in a crisis. There's plenty of money to be made, and the magazines bring a lot of attention to the Newhouses, although as I say that, I realize attention like that was never important to them. I think before I started a story and I didn't finish it, which is happening to me more and more lately, but there was one point when a Fortune reporter, a very well-respected woman, went to the Newhouses wanting to write this story, and this is Fortune magazine, it's not the National Enquirer. And Cy, the brothers pondered it for a while, and then Cy issued a statement, and he said, my brother and I don't believe in giving interviews on principle. And when I saw that, I thought, these are publishers, these are communicators. What principle would keep them from giving out this stuff? At one point, Cy had a woman named Anthea Disney, who was editor-in-chief of his magazine, Self Magazine, and she was fired in one of the many scenes in my book of Cy Newhouse's acting in the most awkward and insensitive ways as editors and as publishers. He went to her country home in Connecticut to fire her, and she went to work for Murdoch as editor of TV Guide, and she now runs his book publishing business. But I said to her, if I were writing a book about Murdoch and I wrote him a letter seeking an interview, would he talk to me? And she said, he wouldn't want to. That's not the way he'd want to spend his afternoon, and he'd grit his teeth and he'd do it. No offense to you, but that he considers it as a part of his duty as a publisher to talk to legitimate journalists. And Cy Newhouse he doesn't get it. In the course of writing the book, I got a letter from Cy's daughter saying that her father values his privacy, and why don't I, show some manners and just let him alone? And I say in the book that if the journalism values were ever discussed over the dinner table at Cy Newhouse's house, his daughter must not have been listening, but my guess is that those principles of journalism and values of journalism and free press were never discussed because Cy Newhouse isn't interested in that. He's interested in publishing magazines that get talked about. Yes?
Was David Remnick his pick?
I'm sorry,
David Remnick, was that Cy Newhouse's pick to edit the New Yorker? Or?
Yeah. That was, but he did it, again, Cy Newhouse he's like the ultimate bumbler in the way that he hires his editors. He had Michael Kinsley ready to take that job, goes out for dinner with the family. Kinsley thinks the job is his. He asks Newhouse just for the night to think it over. And then Newhouse tells him, calls him at his hotel and says, forget it, you don't have the job. Kinsley is so unbuttoned by this that he gets on his computer and he starts sending emails all over the country to people talking about what a jerk Cy Newhouse is, and then Cy gives the job to David Remnick, who I think has gotten exceedingly uncritical press, and the media has just in droves jumped up and down at what a brilliant writer and thinker he is, and there's been really little any kind of critical reporting on David Remnick. But we'll see how the magazine does under him. As I said before, I think the New Yorker is one interesting magazine now. It just doesn't make money, and the reason it doesn't make money is that Cy wants a big circulation. He wants to be a big, popular magazine, so he spends millions of dollars on trying to boost the circulation, and then that circulation has to be constantly contacted and recontacted to try to keep it, and that costs a lot of money, and that is one of the expenses. And of course, all the writers with six-figure contracts, and Tina Brown, who always wanted the magazine to be current, so she would assign twice as many articles as she could use, and then if a story broke on Saturday night and she wanted in that edition, then she'd cancel something else, and the fact checkers couldn't do their job, so the magazine, which was renowned for being accurate and for its fact checking, just really went through a period of a lot of bloopers and embarrassing mistakes. Yes?
Did the big fight over Sam Newhouse's estate and the estate tax matter shed any light on the family for you in writing the book?
I spent a lot of time on that. The IRS claimed that the Newhouses had vastly underestimated the worth of the company on Sam's death. What it shed light on for me was the Byzantine way that the company was structured, so that one newspaper would own another newspaper, would own another magazine, but the people in the organization wouldn't talk to me, so I had to find people outside who would talk to me, and it was very difficult. But I think I have a chapter on that alone, and I think that if I don't have news-breaking information, I did break some ground in reporting about the structure of the company, and also the lawyers at the IRS put up against the Newhouse lawyers and how outfoxed and outclassed they were. And I have a lot in there about the judge who heard the case and then issued his opinion and then went back into private practice. So I think it's an interesting chapter, and I hope I did break some ground in it.
Yeah, it seems as though there are some stories in the Chicago area that you might like to write, but is it because you like to live in Chicago you don't do it?
Well, that's when I wrote my first East Coast book on Alice Longworth, I was asked by, I thought it was terribly snobbish, but I was asked again and again by people, how will a Midwesterner without any Eastern establishment ties, how will you write this book, how will you get the story? And I thought it was kind of insulting, and I just...
I didn't mean that.
No, I understand exactly what you mean. I felt that I'm far better off as an outsider writing these books, because I can tell you at one time, I think I was thinking about writing something about Dan Rostenkowski. And, you know, somebody I don't know at all. I don't have any family or professional ties to him, but I could see how it would be difficult, because I live here, my husband has a law practice here, my kids go to school here, you know people, you have ties. I'm the perfect one to write about Kay Graham, because I'm like a bull in a china shop. I just don't, I'll go follow any lead wherever it goes. And in fact, the Kay Graham story did have Chicago ties to it, because she went to Vassar for 2 years, and then her father told her that she couldn't possibly get a good education at an all-women's school, and he pushed her. He was friendly with Robert Hutchins, and he pushed her over to the University of Chicago. So it's much better to be an outsider. And if I could come up with a great Chicago subject, I'm not sure, and I haven't thought of that person yet, but if I could, I don't think I would pursue it. I think I will stick to one of the coasts or someplace outside where I can go in without being beholden to anybody. Any others? Thank you very much.
Carol Felsenthal's biography of Cy Newhouse, called Citizen Newhouse, is published by 7 Stories Press. You can learn more